The doctors gave me 2 months to live, and I flew to New York City to say goodbye to my daughter, who hadn't spoken to me in 3 years. I just wanted to see her happy, even if from afar, even for just a single instant. Instead, I found her in the intensive care unit, teetering on the brink of death, while her husband was toasting with champagne, surrounded by models in a mansion in the Hamptons, laughing over the phone when I called him. So, I dialed another number. The person on the other end of the line had been waiting for my call for 17 years. An hour later, my daughter's husband was kneeling in front of me in the middle of the hospital hallway, begging for mercy. But it was already too late. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The plane shuddered as it hit an air pocket, and the plastic cup of water nearly tipped over onto the folding tray table. Frank gripped the cup with his palm out of reflex and looked back out the window, where there was nothing but a dense, gray blanket of clouds. He was 57 years old, the last 15 of which he had spent working rotating shifts on the oil rigs of North Dakota. In all that time, he had learned not to fear turbulence, nor the temperatures of 40 degrees below zero, nor the bosses screaming over the phone from their comfortable offices in Houston. But today, his hands were trembling slightly. And it wasn't because of the bumps in the air. In the inside pocket of his jacket, he carried a piece of paper folded into quarters that he had already memorized, though he had only read it once. A diagnosis written with the typical indifference of medical handwriting, a prognosis phrased so ambiguously that someone without experience might have even felt hopeful. But Frank had worked with men who died of this very disease, and he understood perfectly what the phrase palliative care as recommended meant. 2 months, maybe 3 if he was lucky, and luck had never been his strong suit. The strange thing was that he felt almost no fear when the doctor spoke those words. He was sitting in the oncologist's office in Williston, staring at a yellowing poster encouraging regular checkups, and he could only think of one thing: Katie, his daughter, who had last called him 3 years ago. And that conversation had ended in such a way that it would have been better never to have had it at all. He remembered every single one of her words because he had replayed them in his head hundreds of nights in a row, trying to understand the exact moment he had gone wrong and if he could have changed anything. "Dad, you don't understand. Arthur gave me everything I ever dreamed of. A penthouse on the Upper East Side, a car, trips. And you? You couldn't even come to my wedding. Your whole life you've lived in that cave in the north, thinking only about work. You couldn't even save Mom." That last sentence was the knife she twisted between his ribs. The thing about Mom, about Ellen, who wasted away from the same disease that was now devouring him when Katie was just 10 years old. Back then, he was working 20 hours a day to scrape together money for treatment, for a clinic in Houston, for an experimental therapy he had read about on the internet. Nothing worked. Ellen died in his arms 2 days before he managed to gather the necessary sum. And Katie, his little Katie, to whom he could never explain why Dad was always working and why Mom wouldn't open her eyes again, grew up with that thorn buried in her heart. The flight attendant passed down the aisle with the cart, offering drinks and snacks. Frank shook his head and looked back out the window. He wasn't hungry. In reality, he didn't want anything except one thing: to see his daughter. Not to talk to her, because she wouldn't want to listen to him anyway, not to ask for a place in her beautiful new life, because there was no room for him there. Just to see her, to make sure she was happy, to store her smile in his memory, and take that memory with him to the place of no return. He had flown without giving notice because he had no one to call. Her number had been silent for 6 months. Not out of service, simply silent, as if the phone were turned off forever or had been thrown into the Hudson River. At first, Frank thought she had simply changed her number and didn't want to give him the new one. Then he started to worry, but he quickly checked himself. She was an adult. She had a rich husband from a good family. She had everything. She simply didn't want to speak to her father. It was her right. He was the one to blame. The clouds on the other side of the window began to disperse, and the earth appeared below. Brown squares of fields, gray ribbons of highways, the toy-like houses of the suburbs. New York City was close. Frank took out the phone he had turned off during the flight and pressed the power button out of habit. The screen lit up, carrier notifications appeared, and suddenly the phone vibrated with an incoming call, an unknown number from the city area code. He brought the device to his ear, expecting to hear some spam about car warranties or surveys, but the voice on the other end was a woman's, soft and tense, as if the person were speaking while looking over her shoulder. "Frank Miller?" "Yes, speaking. My name is Veronica. I'm a nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital. You are Catherine Sterling's father?" His heart did something strange, as if it tripped on flat ground and forgot how to keep beating. Frank gripped the phone so hard the plastic creaked. "Yes, she's my daughter. What happened to her? You need to come as soon as possible." "Only you. Her husband must not find out." "What does that mean, he must not find out? What happened? Is she alive?" The pause on the other end of the line felt like an eternity. "For now. But it really is best that you come." She dictated the address and the floor number, and then the line went dead, as if someone had abruptly yanked the cord from the wall. Frank sat motionless, staring at the black screen, feeling something shift inside him. The fear he had felt a second ago didn't disappear, but another feeling joined it. Cold and clear, like the winter sky over North Dakota. He had flown to the city to die, to say goodbye to his daughter and leave in silence. But now, the plans had changed. The plane touched the runway with a barely perceptible bump, and the passengers around him began to move, reaching for the overhead bins. Frank didn't get up from his seat until the aisle was nearly empty. He was thinking, trying to process what he had heard. A nurse, not a doctor, not an official hospital representative, but a nurse, calling in secret and asking him to come without the husband knowing. That could only mean one thing, something very bad, something the husband wanted to hide. He hailed a cab at the terminal exit, gave the address, and leaned back in the rear seat. New York City outside the window was strange and unrecognizable, even though he had been born in this state and lived here for the first 30 years of his life. Everything had changed. New skyscrapers, new highway interchanges, new billboards with faces of people he didn't know. The city lived its own life, and had long since forgotten Frank Miller from the oil fields, who had once walked these streets with his little daughter on his shoulders. His phone vibrated again. This time it was a message from the bank about the cab charge on his card. Frank checked the balance out of habit and smiled bitterly. He had little money left, but he wouldn't need it anymore. He had planned to spend his last savings renting a hotel room, seeing his daughter from afar, and buying a return ticket he probably wouldn't use. But now everything had changed. Now he had a purpose. He took the oncologist's certificate out of his pocket, unfolded it, reread the cold medical phrasing one more time, and then slowly and carefully tore the paper into small pieces. 2 months, maybe 3. It was enough. It would be enough for everything necessary. Memories arrived without permission, as usually happens when one travels somewhere in silence, watching a foreign world pass by the window. Katie at 5 years old, cheeks smeared with jam, laughing so contagiously that the neighbors banged on the wall. Katie at 10, serious and quiet, dressed in black at Mom's funeral, holding his hand without crying because Dad had told her they had to be strong. Katie at 18, with her honors diploma and shining eyes, saying she would definitely become a famous designer and make them proud of the family name. Katie at 25, dressed as a bride in white, in a photograph she sent him by mail with a brief note, "I got married. His name is Arthur. Why didn't you come?" He didn't come because he couldn't, because that day he was in the hospital with a heart attack and didn't even know she had set the wedding date. She didn't tell him the date in advance. She simply sent the invitation 3 days before, when it was already too late to buy tickets and ask for time off work. She did it on purpose. She wanted him not to come so she could throw it in his face later. Or maybe he had invented that himself, so the thought that his daughter didn't want to see him on the most important day of her life wouldn't hurt so much. The taxi turned onto the street leading to the hospital, and Frank felt his mouth go dry. The enormous medical complex emerged from around the corner, and he asked the driver to stop at the main entrance. He paid, got out, stood for a minute in the biting wind gathering his courage, and then entered. The lobby was crowded and noisy, like a bus station. People with tense faces stood in line at reception, sat on hard benches, spoke on phones, cried in corners. Frank walked past them, following the signs to the indicated wing. 3rd floor, intensive care unit, heavy doors with a keypad lock. He stopped, not knowing what to do, and then the door opened from the inside. A woman in her 40s wearing blue scrubs, with a tired face and piercing gaze, looked at him, and he understood it was Veronica. "Frank Miller? Come with me. We need to talk before you see her." She took him aside to a small alcove near a window where there were 2 plastic chairs and a pot with a dusty ficus. She looked around as if checking that no one was listening and began to speak quickly and quietly. Officially, she was in a traffic accident. That is her husband's version, and that is how it is recorded in the documents. Unofficially, it is very different. I've been working here for 12 years, and I've seen enough to distinguish an accident from a beating. She was admitted 4 days ago with multiple traumas, internal bleeding, and a concussion. Her husband came once, stayed 5 minutes, and left. Since then, he hasn't even called to ask about her condition. Frank listened, and something dark rose inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time, since that time in '98 when his crew was swindled out of their pay, and he, with 3 other equally cheated men, went to settle the score with those responsible. That was the first time he understood he was capable of things he hadn't thought of before. "Why did you call me specifically?" Veronica looked him in the eyes. "Because she was calling for you." When they brought her in, she was unconscious, but the whole time she kept repeating just one word: Dad. Not Arthur, not Mom, not some friend. Dad. His throat closed up so tight it was hard to breathe. 3 years of silence, 3 years of resentment and distance, and when things got truly bad, she called for him. For him, not the husband who had promised her everything and given her only pain. "I want to see her." "First, listen to everything. This isn't the first time she's been admitted here. In the last 8 months, she has been hospitalized 3 times. The first time with a broken arm, the second with a hairline fracture in her ribs. Each time the husband came, brought some papers, spoke with the director, and she was discharged early. I tried to talk to her, but she just cried and asked me not to tell anyone. She was afraid, very afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of him. Not just him, but his whole family. His father owns a massive commercial real estate empire. He has contacts everywhere. An uncle in the district attorney's office. They can make any police report disappear before a detective even sees it." She understood that, and that's why she stayed silent. Frank stood up. His legs didn't want to obey, but he forced himself to take a step, then another. "Take me to her." Veronica nodded and walked ahead, opening doors with her badge. They walked down a long hallway impregnated with the smell of the hospital and misfortune, passing rooms with closed doors and monitors beeping their monotonous count of other people's lives. Then, Veronica stopped in front of one of the doors and turned. "Prepare yourself. She looks bad." She pushed the door open, and Frank entered. In the bed, wrapped in tubes and wires, lay his daughter, his Katie, whom he once tossed toward the ceiling, catching her with his large hands while she squealed with joy. Now, nothing remained of that little girl. Her face was pale, almost gray, eyes closed with bruises around them that no makeup could hide, lips split, neck held by a brace. Beneath it, purple marks were visible. He had seen those marks before. He knew what left them. Fingers. Human fingers squeezing the throat until the victim stops moving. Frank collapsed into the chair next to the bed and took her thin, cold, weak hand. The same hand he held 30 years ago in the maternity ward when the nurse brought him a small bundle and told him it was a girl. Back then, he wept with happiness. Now, he wept too, but for something completely different. For a long time, he simply sat and watched her, listening to the rhythmic beep of the machines and the noise of his own blood in his ears. He thought about how everything could have been different if he had gone to the wedding, if he had insisted on meeting Arthur sooner, if he hadn't let her drift so far away from him. But the past cannot be changed. One can only try to fix the future. And for that, he had 2 months, maybe 3. Then he got up, left the room, and found Veronica waiting in the hallway. "Are her things here?" "Yes, in storage on this floor. The husband didn't pick them up. I need her phone." Veronica hesitated, but then nodded and left. A few minutes later, she returned with a clear plastic bag containing clothes, a purse, and a phone with a shattered screen. Frank took the phone and pressed the button. The screen was cracked, but it lit up. It had 20% battery left and no passcode. He opened the gallery and started looking at the photos. Katie happy at some resort, Katie with a glass of wine in a restaurant, Katie and Arthur on a yacht. Everything beautiful, everything correct, everything fake. And then the videos appeared. One of them was dated last month. He pressed play. On the screen appeared the face of a young man, handsome, with insolent eyes, and the smile of someone used to getting whatever he wants. Off camera, a woman's crying could be heard, along with strange, drunken laughter. "Katie, come on. Say something for Daddy. Say you fell on your own." The camera swiveled, and Frank saw his daughter with a split lip, ruined makeup, and the eyes of a cornered animal. She was looking somewhere off camera at someone she feared greatly, and she spoke with a dead voice. "I fell on my own." The laughter off camera grew louder. Female voices, several at once. "See, Daddy-in-law? Your little daughter is fine with me. Try coming to fix things. You're just a rig worker from the north, right? And what are you going to do? File a report?" More laughter. Then the video cut out. Frank stood in the hospital hallway, staring at the black screen of the broken phone. His hands weren't trembling. He was already beyond fear, anger, and despair. He was in that place where only cold clarity remains, and the understanding of what must be done. He took out his own phone, found a number in his contacts that he hadn't dialed in 17 years, and pressed call. The rings dragged on one after another, and he thought the number was dead when a hoarse, deep voice with a slight Midwestern accent sounded in the earpiece. "Speak. Mike. It's Frank." From the rig fire. "Do you remember 2007? A long pause, then a sigh that sounded like a laugh. 17 years, Frank. 17 years I waited for this call. You know what I always said. One call. Any debt. You dragged me out of that inferno alive. Speak, brother. Who are we taking down?" Frank looked at the closed door of the ICU where his daughter lay. He looked at the phone with the video that had burned itself into his memory forever, and pronounced just one last name. The Sterlings. Veronica found him in the hospital cafeteria on the first floor. 2 hours after that call, Frank was sitting at a plastic table by the window. In front of him was a cup of instant coffee that had gone cold long ago and was covered with a thin film. He wasn't looking at the coffee. He wasn't looking out the window. He wasn't looking anywhere in particular. He was simply sitting and waiting, like a man who has already made a decision and is now watching the universe reorganize itself around that decision. The nurse sat opposite him, put her hands on the table, and for a while kept silent, studying his face. Then she asked in a low voice, almost a whisper, "What did you do, Frank?" "Nothing special. I called a person I once helped." "You called? And what's going to happen now?" He finally raised his eyes to her. Veronica saw something in his eyes that unsettled her, neither anger, nor fury, nor thirst, something much more terrifying. Calm, the absolute and icy calm of a man who knows exactly what he is doing. Now there will be justice. Not revenge, not violence, not a shootout like in the movies. Simply justice. The truth will come to light, and people will answer for what they have been doing for years. "I don't understand." And you don't need to understand. It is better that you forget I called you and that we spoke. If anyone asks, you are just a nurse doing her job. Agreed? Veronica nodded slowly, though it was evident she wanted to ask 1,000 more questions, but she had been working in that hospital long enough to understand that there are situations where it is better not to know too much. There are people around whom things happen that no one talks about out loud later. "How is she?" Frank asked. "No change. The doctors say the next 48 hours will be decisive. If her body overcomes the inflammation and her kidneys don't fail, there is hope." "What percentage of hope?" "More or less 50%. Maybe a little less. 50%, half and half." Frank thought about the irony hidden in those numbers. The doctors had given him almost a 100% guarantee of death in a few months, while his daughter balanced on the edge with the odds of a coin toss. And he could do nothing to change those odds. Not money, not contacts, not that call he had just made. Medicine works according to its own laws, and no dossier of dirt on rich families will make cancer cells stop or failing organs work again. Can I be with her? Just sit by her side? Officially, visits aren't allowed in the ICU, but I can take you in again if you behave discreetly and don't draw attention, just for a while. They went up to the 3rd floor. They passed through the same heavy keypad doors. In the room, nothing had changed. The same machines, the same rhythmic beep, the same pale figure in the bed that was once his little girl. Frank sat in the same chair, took her hand again, and this time spoke aloud, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Katie, it's Dad. I came late, I know. Too late, as always. You were right when you said I always arrive late. I was late to the wedding. I was late to your whole adult life, but I'm here now, and I promise you one thing. He will never touch you again. Not him, not his father, not his whole family. They think they can buy everything in the world, that money solves any problem, but there are things that cannot be bought. There are people who don't give a damn about their money, and there is a truth that sooner or later comes to light. He fell silent, still holding her hand. Outside, it was getting dark. New York City was turning on its lights, indifferent to the small human tragedies unfolding behind each of its millions of windows. Somewhere in this city, Arthur Sterling was celebrating another party, drinking champagne, hugging models, and not suspecting that his life had already begun to crumble, that the first stones had already broken loose from the mountain and were rolling downhill, dragging an avalanche with them. Frank's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. An unknown number. Then another call, and another. He didn't answer, just watched the screen light up again and again, allowing himself a small, grim smile. It had begun. Veronica peeked into the room and signaled that it was time to leave. Frank leaned toward his daughter, kissed her carefully on the forehead, trying not to touch the wires and tubes. "Hang in there, Katie. Dad is here. Dad is going to fix everything." In the hallway, he took out his phone and looked at the missed calls. 7 in the last 10 minutes, all from different New York numbers. He picked one at random and returned the call. They answered almost immediately, and the voice on the other end was clearly agitated. "Is this Frank Miller, father of Catherine Sterling?" "Yes, speaking. My name is Andrew. I'm a journalist with the New York Times investigative desk. We received materials about the Sterling family, very serious materials. It indicates that you are the contact person. We want to ask you some questions. Is it true that Arthur Sterling systematically beat your daughter, that she was hospitalized repeatedly, that his family covered up the incidents each time?" "Yes, it is true. Every last word. Are you willing to give an official interview?" "No, but I'll give you something better. On my daughter's phone, there is a video where her husband forces her to say on camera that she fell on her own. If you want, I can send it to you." A pause on the other end of the line. That would be very important for the report. For the investigation. Then write down the email address. In 5 minutes, the video was sent to the indicated address, then to another, and a third. Frank returned calls to all the numbers that had contacted him, and it turned out they were journalists, bloggers, editors of investigative media. All had received the same package of documents about the Sterling family's financial maneuvers. All wanted confirmation of details, comments, and to all of them, Frank gave the same thing: the video from his daughter's phone and his dry, factual testimony. He didn't dramatize. He didn't sob on the phone. He didn't curse the son-in-law with the worst words. He simply laid out the facts as a man who had been a crew chief on the northern rigs for 15 years knew how to do, accustomed to clear formulations. Date of the first hospitalization, nature of the injuries, words of the nurses, reaction of the husband, everything fit into a complete picture that caused chills. When the calls finally ceased, Frank went down to the lobby and stepped out onto the street. The cold city air burned his lungs, and he coughed long and heavily. The cancer made its presence known, not letting him forget that time was limited. But now, that was even a good thing. Each fit of coughing was a reminder that he had nothing to lose. And a man who has nothing to lose is capable of things inaccessible to those who cling to life, career, and reputation. The phone rang again. This time it was Mike, the man from the old days. "Frank, how's it going? Any regrets?" "No. Why? Is there a reason to?" "There's chatter. Lots of chatter. Old man Sterling is already contacting everyone he knows, trying to figure out where the leak came from. His son, apparently, hasn't caught on yet. Still partying somewhere, won't even answer his phone." "That's good. Listen, I want you to understand one thing. What I set in motion can't be stopped now. It's like a snowball that starts rolling, gathers more and more snow, and in the end becomes an avalanche. The Sterlings are going to be shaken, hard and deep. The IRS, the FBI, the SEC, things are going to come out that nobody is going to like. I'm ready. Are you ready for this to potentially affect your daughter too? After all, she was part of that family." Frank fell silent, reflecting on the question. He hadn't thought about that before, but now he understood that Mike was right. Katie was Arthur's wife. Formally, she could also be affected if joint accounts, properties, or financial operations came to light. She is a victim, Mike, not an accomplice. Any decent investigator will see that. All right, if you say so. But if I were you, I'd look for a good lawyer just in case. Lawyers cost money. I don't have any. You will. I'm going to wire you something. Don't argue. You saved my life. I have the right to spend part of mine in gratitude. The line went dead. Frank put the phone away and looked at the hospital building, enormous and indifferent under the streetlights. Somewhere up there, on the third floor, his daughter was fighting for her life, while at some other end of the city, her husband was still enjoying his impunity, not knowing that the world around him was already in flames. He went back inside and found a quiet corner in the lobby where he could sit and wait. There was nothing to wait for except news from the doctors, but he couldn't leave the hospital. Physically he could, of course, but his soul wouldn't let him. Too many years he had been far away when he should have been close. Now he would be here, even if that meant sitting on a hard plastic chair all night and listening to a homeless man snore in the corner of the lobby. The clock showed 9:30 p.m. when Veronica found him again. She had a strange expression on her face, simultaneously frightened and excited. "Have you seen the news?" "No." "What happened?" She handed him her phone. On the screen was a news feed, and the first article made him read with attention. Businessman Richard Sterling, owner of Sterling Commercial Properties, detained for questioning regarding an investigation into massive financial fraud. According to sources, it involves multi-million-dollar kickbacks in public infrastructure construction projects. Frank handed the phone back to the nurse. "They work fast." "You did this?" "I just made a call." The rest was done by people who gathered information for many years and waited for the right moment. But why? You could have just gone to the police, filed a report for the beatings, and what would have happened? The report would have landed on the desk of some detective who is friends with Arthur's uncle in the DA's office. They would have filed it, lost it, forgotten it, and in a week, Arthur would have taken my daughter out of the hospital and finished killing her. No, Veronica. Police reports work against common people, against people like you and me, but not against those who have money and contacts. For them, another method is needed. Which one? Publicity. When every newspaper writes about you, when your face is on every news site, when journalists dig into your past and find things even you had forgotten, then no contact helps anymore. Because all your friends in power instantly become former friends. They don't want their names appearing next to yours. They turn their backs, pretend they never knew you, and then you are left alone against the system that used to work for you. Veronica looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. This quiet, exhausted man with weathered hands and hollow cheeks turned out to be someone very different from what he seemed at first glance. Behind his calm facade hid a person who knew how to think several steps ahead and wasn't afraid to play for high stakes. "You are a dangerous man, Frank. I'm just a father whose daughter was taken from him. And a man with 2 or 3 months to live. What makes me dangerous isn't my character, but the circumstances." "What did you say? 2 or 3 months?" He realized he had spoken too much, but didn't try to deny it. What was the point of hiding what would soon be evident? Cancer. Stage 4. I flew to the city to say goodbye to Katie, not to get revenge on her husband. That's just how things turned out. Veronica kept silent for a long time, then sat next to him on the adjacent chair and said in a low voice, "My father died of cancer when I was 20. He also worked in the north, on the rigs. He also didn't have time to do many of the things he wanted. I understand better than you think." They sat together in the silence of the lobby, two strangers brought together by someone else's misfortune. Outside the hospital windows, the New York night flowed by, indifferent and infinite. Somewhere far from there, the empire of the Sterling family was crumbling. Houses of cards built on reputations were falling. Phones were ringing that no one wanted to answer. And here, in an intensive care room, a young woman named Catherine continued her silent struggle for the right to breathe. Around midnight, Frank's phone rang again. The number was unknown, but something compelled him to answer. "Frank Miller? This is Assistant U.S. Attorney Martinez, Special Crimes Unit. We want to invite you to give a statement, tomorrow at 10 a.m. I'll dictate the address." "Go ahead." He wrote the address on a napkin, hung up, and allowed himself a smile. The machinery had been set in motion, The official machinery of justice, which usually works slowly and with creaks, but when it finally accelerates, it doesn't stop. The Sterlings believed they were above the law. They were wrong. No one is above the law when the law is backed by public attention and investigative journalism. Veronica went to her floor, promising to notify him if Katie's condition changed. Frank remained alone in the semi-empty lobby among plastic chairs and vending machines. He didn't sleep all night. He just sat and thought, reviewing the events of the last few hours in his mind. In the morning he would testify to the prosecutor, tell everything he knew, show the video, give the dates of the hospitalizations, and then return here to wait for his daughter to open her eyes if she opened them at all. Near dawn, he finally dozed off and had a strange dream. He was back in North Dakota in 2007, in that accident that changed his life. The technical building was burning, black smoke billowing, people screaming and running everywhere. He ran inside because someone said there were people left in there. He found a man unconscious, trapped under a fallen beam. He carried him out on his back, even though the man weighed more than he did. He got him out into the air, laid him on the ground, and then the building behind him collapsed completely. That man lost a leg, but he survived. Frank suffered burns and lung problems that perhaps had led to his current diagnosis. And the man he saved became someone very different, someone who knows how to gather information and wait 17 years for the right moment to repay his debt. Frank woke up because someone was shaking his shoulder. He opened his eyes and saw Veronica. Her face was pale, but her eyes shone with something resembling hope. She regained consciousness for a moment, literally a minute, but she asked for you. She asked if her dad was here. Frank jumped up so fast his head spun. He grabbed the back of the chair so as not to fall and followed the nurse with legs that wouldn't obey him. His heart beat somewhere in his throat, preventing him from breathing. She had regained consciousness. She asked for him. She remembered him. At the door of the intensive care unit, he stopped to catch his breath. Then he pushed the door and entered. Katie lay in the bed with her eyes closed, but something had changed in her face. It wasn't as gray as the day before, and when he sat beside her and took her hand, she weakly squeezed his fingers in response. "Dad," she whispered without opening her eyes. "I'm here, Katie. Dad is here. I'm not going anywhere." A tear rolled down her cheek and disappeared into the pillow. Frank leaned closer, feeling his own eyes traitorously sting. "Forgive me, Dad. For everything. For those words. For the silence. I was a fool. No need. Rest. Gather your strength. We'll talk later. We have plenty of time." He lied. Of course, he didn't have plenty of time, but she didn't need to know that. Now she only needed one thing, to know that her father was close, that she was loved, that she was no longer alone. Katie sank back into sleep, but her fingers didn't let go of his hand, and Frank stayed sitting beside her without moving, without letting go of her hand, watching a new day dawn outside the window, a day in which everything would change definitively. At that very moment when Frank was sitting by his daughter's bed holding her hand, 30 miles from the hospital, a very different scene was unfolding. The mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, was flooded with lights. The music thumped so loud it could be heard from the neighboring estates, and by the heated pool, a group of a dozen people had gathered, clearly not planning to end the party before dawn. Arthur Sterling, 32 years old, heir to the commercial empire and husband of the woman who at that moment was fighting for her life in the ICU, lay on a lounge chair with a glass of champagne in his hand, watching two models in bikinis play some silly game with a beach ball. He was drunk, but not too drunk. Just enough to feel a pleasant relaxation and not think about anything serious. And serious things had accumulated quite a bit lately. Katie was in the hospital again. Again those bruises. Again the doctor's questions. Again the need to call his father and ask him to handle it. But his father always handled it, and everything always ended well. A few calls, an envelope to the right person, and already the documents showed domestic accident or consequences of a traffic collision. The system worked like a clock, and Arthur had long ago stopped worrying about such trifles. One of the models, a long-legged blonde named Christina, approached his lounge chair and sat next to him, shaking water droplets from her tanned shoulders. "Arthur, where's your wife? Sick again." He smiled smugly and took a sip of champagne. "Something always happens to her at the doctor's. She's very fragile. Maybe she lacks vitamins. Maybe she lacks a brain." Christina laughed, and Arthur felt the habitual pleasure of his own wit. He liked it when beautiful women laughed at his jokes. He liked feeling like the center of attention, the master of the situation, the man to whom everything was permitted. And tonight, he felt exactly that. The phone lying on the small table next to the bottle of Dom Perignon vibrated for the third time in the last hour. Arthur looked at the screen and saw Dad, his father again. Probably wanted to know how the party was going or remind him of the meeting with investors tomorrow. It didn't matter. He would return the call in the morning. He rejected the call and went back to contemplating the models in the pool. Life was beautiful. The phone rang again. This time Arthur finally answered because it was already the 6th call in a row and it was starting to irritate him. "Dad, what is it? I'm busy." The voice of his father in the earpiece was strange. Not like usual. Richard Sterling always spoke with confidence, clearly, like a man used to giving orders. But now in his voice, something unusual could be heard, something resembling fear. "Son, where are you?" "At the house with friends." "Why?" "The feds came to see me. The anti-corruption unit. They're asking about the infrastructure contracts, about the 2014 projects." Arthur sat up slowly on the lounge chair. The drunkenness began to dissipate from his head with alarming speed. "Dad, this isn't for phone talk. They know everything, Arthur. Everything. They have documents, accounts, correspondence." "From where? Who leaked?" "Wait, I don't understand. What documents? What are you talking about?" "About what has kept our family afloat for the last 10 years. The kickbacks, the schemes, the people we paid off. All of that is now in the hands of the investigators." And the line went dead. Arthur stood staring at the phone, trying to understand what had happened. Then he dialed his father again. Long rings. Then the mechanical voice of voicemail. Same thing again. Christina noticed his expression had changed and moved closer. "Hey, what's wrong? Did something happen?" "I don't know. Probably. I need to make some calls." He got up and walked away from the pool, dialing the family lawyer's number. Busy. His Uncle Victor's number, the one in the DA's office. "The number you dialed is turned off or out of coverage." The number of his father's business partner, with whom they had built those infrastructure projects together. "The phone is turned off or out of service area." Something was very wrong. Very wrong. Arthur opened the browser on his phone and typed his father's name into the search bar. What he saw made him grab the back of the nearest chair so he wouldn't fall. Owner of Sterling Mall's chain detained on suspicion of multi-million-dollar fraud. Scandal surrounding infrastructure projects. New details. Sterling family under investigation. What is known so far? And more, and more, and more. Dozens of headlines, each more terrible than the last. Arthur scrolled through the news, feeling the ground sinking beneath his feet. From where? How? Who could have done this? One article caught his attention especially. Domestic violence in elite family. Wife of commercial empire heir hospitalized repeatedly for beatings. He opened it and saw his face in the photograph. Next to it was a photo of Katie, clearly taken from her social media, and beneath the photos, text that made him sweat cold. According to sources in medical circles, Catherine Sterling was admitted at least 3 times in the last 8 months to different city hospitals with injuries characteristic of domestic violence victims. Each time her husband, Arthur Sterling, insisted on the version of domestic accidents, and thanks to his family's contacts, these cases did not receive due attention. Further down was a video. That same video he had recorded a month ago when he was drunk and furious and wanted to show that fool who was boss in the house. He had forced her to speak to the camera saying she had fallen on her own, and he had laughed, and the girls around him had laughed too. Now that video was on the internet, and hundreds of thousands of people had already seen it, according to the view counter. Arthur threw the phone onto the grass and covered his face with his hands. This was the end. The total and definitive end. Even if his father got out of the illegal kickback story, even if the uncle in the DA's office managed to fix something in the criminal case, this video could not be erased. It had spread all over the internet, all the major channels had shared it, millions of people were discussing it in the comments. Suddenly, he realized that he had never felt so helpless before. His whole life, any problem was solved with money or contacts. Disrespected a cop and got a ticket? Dad called. Crashed into someone's car and didn't want to pay? The lawyer fixed it. Beat your wife half to death? The hospital director signed the necessary papers. But now, all those mechanisms were useless because the information had been released and had taken on a life of its own. It couldn't be bribed, intimidated, or crushed with authority. It simply existed, and with every minute, there was more of it. Christina and the other guests began to realize something. Someone was already looking at their phone. Someone whispered. The festive atmosphere vanished as if someone had flipped an invisible switch. People began to leave, muttering apologies and claiming urgent matters. Half an hour later, by the pool, only Arthur remained, sitting on a lounge chair with an empty glass in his hand, staring into the darkness. The phone rang again. This time the number was unknown. Arthur answered mechanically without thinking. Arthur Sterling? This is Assistant U.S. Attorney Martinez, Special Crimes Unit. You must present yourself for questioning. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. I will dictate the address. He wrote the address on a napkin he found on the table and hung up. His hands were trembling. His head was empty, like a looted house. An hour later, he was speeding through the nocturnal city in his Porsche Cayenne, respecting neither speed limits nor rules. He needed to go see Katie. He needed to see her, talk, understand what was happening. She must be in that private clinic where they usually took her after the incidents. But when he arrived, the doctor on duty looked at him with barely concealed disdain and told him that Catherine Sterling was not registered there. Then where is she? As I understand it, at Mount Sinai Hospital, in the ICU. ICU. Intensive care. That word hit him like a slap. He knew he had hit her harder than usual. He knew she had fallen badly and hit her head. But intensive care, that was too much. That exceeded what could be silenced and forgotten. He drove to Mount Sinai, violating every possible rule and miraculously without getting into an accident. At the hospital entrance, he parked directly on the sidewalk, got out of the car, and rushed inside. In the lobby, he grabbed the first nurse who passed by the arm and almost shouted in her face, "Where is the ICU? I need to see my wife, Catherine Sterling." The nurse stepped back and pointed toward the elevators. Arthur ran without noticing the looks following him from everywhere. He didn't know that people who had read the news or seen that video already recognized his face. He didn't understand that to others, he was no longer the heir to a wealthy family, but the man who beat his wife and recorded it on video. On the third floor, security stopped him. Two burly men in uniform blocked his path and asked for identification. "I am the husband of a patient. You must let me pass." "One moment, we're going to verify." One of the guards called somewhere, spoke in a low voice, then looked at Arthur with an expression difficult to decipher. "You cannot see the patient. Orders of the attending physician." "What do you mean I can't? I have the right. I am her husband. The same husband who beat her for 8 months straight." The voice came from somewhere to the side. Arthur turned and saw a woman in medical uniform, middle-aged, with a tired face and a look that boded nothing good. "And who are you?" "I am the nurse who received your wife at this hospital 3 times. I saw her fractures, her bruises, her tears, and I called her father because someone had to protect her." The father. That word made Arthur freeze. He knew Katie had a father, a rig worker from the north who hadn't appeared in their lives for years. Katie sometimes mentioned him when she was especially depressed, but Arthur never took him seriously. What could a simple platform worker do against the Sterling family? Where is this father of hers? Here. In the room with his daughter. Unlike you, he came as soon as he found out. Arthur advanced toward the unit doors, but the guards blocked his path again. He tried to push them aside, but they were stronger than they looked, and a second later he was face against the wall with his arms twisted behind his back. "Calm down, citizen, or we call the police. Do you know who I am?" "We know. The guy from the video who beats women and forces them to lie on camera." Those words sobered him up better than any cold shower. He stopped struggling and let the guards take him aside. He stood leaning against the wall, breathing heavily, trying to figure out what to do next. At that moment, the ICU door opened, and out stepped a short, thin man with hollow cheeks and weathered hands, dressed in a simple jacket and worn jeans. Nothing special, a common middle-aged laborer, but something in his eyes made Arthur freeze. The man approached, stopped a few steps away, and looked at Arthur with a long, heavy gaze. "So this is what you are. Arthur Sterling, the prince on the white horse, the one who promised my daughter a fairy tale and gave her hell. Listen, I don't know what they've told you, but this is all a misunderstanding. Katie, she fell on her own." "Shut up. A single word pronounced in a low, quiet voice, but with such force that Arthur effectively fell silent as if his mouth had been sealed. "I saw the video. I heard you laughing. I saw my daughter's face when she says to the camera what you force her to say. I saw her in that room full of tubes and bruises. So don't come to me with misunderstanding. How much do you want?" This question slipped out of Arthur automatically. His whole life, any problem was solved with money, and he didn't know how to think any other way. "How much? $1 million? 5? 10? I'll sign everything over to Katie: apartments, cars, accounts. I'll give her the divorce without any conditions. Just stop all this. Take down the articles, delete the video." Frank looked at him in silence, and on his face, it was impossible to read any emotion. Arthur interpreted this as a signal to continue. "I have money. Not as much as before, but enough. I can transfer to your account, say, 200,000 right now. It's not a bribe. It's compensation for everything I did, for the pain I caused your daughter. I understand that money can't fix the past, but it can help build the future. 200,000, 500,000. I'll find that sum even if I have to sell everything I have. And what must I do for those 500,000? Simply stop all this. Tell the investigators that you exaggerated, that Katie fell on her own, that the video was recorded as a joke. A stupid joke. People will believe it. People always believe what they want to believe." Frank took a step forward, and Arthur involuntarily took a step back. Less than a yard remained between them. "Do you know how much I earn a year on my shift on the rigs? A little over 50,000. 500,000 is 10 years of my work. A lot of money for someone like me. There you have it. It's good money. You could." I didn't finish. 10 years of work. "And you think for that money I'm going to betray my daughter? That I'm going to tell the investigators she fell on her own when I saw the video where you beat her? When I saw her in that room full of bruises and tubes? It's not a proposal of betrayal. It's a proposal of compromise." Compromise. Nice word. "And do you know what compromise you proposed to my daughter all these months? Shut up. Take it. Pretend everything is fine and then I won't kill you completely. That was your compromise." Arthur felt cold sweat running down his back. This conversation was not going at all as he had planned. The man in front of him didn't react to money, didn't fear threats, didn't try to negotiate. He simply stood and looked at him like a python looks at a rabbit. "What do you want then? Tell me what you want and I'll do it. Anything." "Nothing." "What do you mean nothing? Everyone has a price." "I don't have a price because I have nothing to buy. I have 2 or 3 months to live. I have cancer, stage 4. Money is useless to me because I won't have time to spend it. Power is useless to me because there is no one to exercise it over and no time to do it. The only thing I need is to know that my daughter is safe, and she will be safe only when you are in prison." Those words hit Arthur like a sledgehammer to the head. Cancer, stage 4, 2 or 3 months. The man who had destroyed his life was himself on the brink of death. There was a monstrous irony in this, a cosmic injustice. You speak seriously about the cancer?" "Absolutely seriously. I flew to the city to say goodbye to Katie, not to take revenge on you, not to destroy your family. Just to say goodbye, because she hadn't spoken to me in 3 years, and I wanted to see her one last time. And instead, I found her on the brink of death, and then I discovered you had beaten her for 8 months straight." Tears ran down Arthur's face, but they weren't tears of repentance. It was fear in its pure state. The animal terror of a person who, for the first time in his life, encountered something that cannot be bought, intimidated, or destroyed. "I'm going to fix myself, I swear. I'll never touch her again. I'll do therapy, treatment, whatever. Just don't send me to jail, please." "It's too late, Arthur, too late." Frank turned around and walked back toward the ICU door. At the entrance, he stopped and turned. "You know, I wanted to forgive you. I really wanted to. I came here to simply take my daughter and leave, take her where you couldn't reach her and give her the chance to start over. But then I saw that video and heard you laughing. You were laughing, Arthur, at her fear, at her pain. That was when I understood that here there is nothing to forgive." He entered the ward, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. Arthur remained sitting on the floor, in a puddle of his own tears, under the gazes of the guards and the nurse who had called his father-in-law. A few minutes later, the police arrived. They lifted him from the floor, handcuffed him, and led him toward the exit. People in the lobby recorded him with their phones. Someone shouted insults. Someone simply watched with silent condemnation. The world of Arthur Sterling had collapsed definitively and irrevocably, and no money could change that. The police car took Arthur to the precinct to give a statement, but just a few hours later they let him go on his own recognizance with orders not to leave the city. Formally, they hadn't pressed charges yet. He only had witness status in his father's financial fraud case and suspect status in the systematic violence case. However, the duty prosecutor immediately requested a restraining order against approaching Katie, which the judge granted without hesitation. He was notified in writing that he could not approach the hospital or contact her while the investigation lasted. The lawyer he managed to get late at night advised him to stay quiet, make no statements to the press, and await the development of events. But Arthur didn't know how to stay quiet, nor did he know how to wait. His whole life he had been accustomed to acting, to pressuring, to imposing his will through any obstacle. And now, when everything was crumbling around him, he couldn't simply cross his arms and watch his existence turn to ash. The morning found him in an apartment in Chelsea that he rented for encounters his wife wasn't supposed to know about. He hadn't slept all night, checking the news and watching the number of publications about his family grow exponentially. By 8 a.m., the scandal had already been covered by all major media outlets, and the video of Katie's beating had surpassed 3 million views. Arthur couldn't read the comments below it because after the first 10, he started to shake. His phone exploded with calls, but they weren't friends or partners. Journalists, bloggers, strangers who wanted comments or simply to unload their hatred. Arthur silenced the phone and threw it on the sofa, but that didn't make him feel better. He tried to communicate with his father, but Richard Sterling was still unavailable. According to the news, he had been detained for interrogation and hadn't been released yet. Uncle Victor from the DA's office hadn't answered calls for 2 days. The business partners, who yesterday called him brother and swore eternal friendship, seemed to have evaporated from the face of the earth. For the first time in his life, Arthur understood what it meant to be truly alone. Around 10 a.m., he made a decision. He had to go back to the hospital and talk to his father-in-law man to man without hysteria or threats. Maybe it wasn't too late to negotiate. Maybe that rig worker from the north simply didn't understand who he had messed with, and he could be convinced to back down. After all, everyone has their price. Absolutely everyone. He put on a clean shirt, cleaned himself up as best he could, and called an Uber because his Porsche was left by the hospital, and picking it up now was too risky. The driver recognized him on the way and shot him sideways, glances in the rearview mirror the whole trip, but said nothing. Arthur pretended not to notice. At the hospital entrance, journalists with cameras were swarming. Someone had leaked the information that the victim of domestic violence was right there, and now they lurked, waiting to get exclusive shots. Arthur circled the building to the other side and entered through the service entrance he remembered from previous visits. The lobby was full of people as always. No one paid attention to him because here everyone had their own problems and their own pain. Arthur went up to the 3rd floor and stopped in front of the ICU doors. There were no guards, probably changed shift after the night. He pushed the door and entered. A long hallway with rooms on both sides. Smell of medicine and disinfectant. Soft beeping of monitors behind closed doors. Arthur walked slowly, peeking into each room through the glass windows until he found the one he was looking for. Katie lay in the bed, still connected to the machines, but something had changed. She was conscious. Her eyes were open, and she was looking somewhere at the ceiling while a nurse checked the monitor readings. Next to the bed sat that man, her father. He was holding her hand and saying something to her in a low voice. Arthur pushed the door and entered the room. The reaction was instantaneous. Katie saw him and shuddered with her whole body. Her eyes widened in terror, and the monitors began to beep faster, registering the increased heart rate. The nurse turned and opened her mouth to scream. Frank got up from the chair and took a step forward, interposing his body between Arthur and his daughter. "Stay where you are." The voice was low, but there was something in it that made Arthur stop mid-step. He raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "I just want to talk calmly. No scenes. Just talk. Katie, do you want him here?" She shook her head, and that weak, almost imperceptible movement hit Arthur harder than any punch. 3 years ago, this woman looked at him with adoration. 2 years ago, she still tried to justify him. A year ago, she began to fear him. And now, in her eyes, there was only fear and disgust. "Call security," Frank told the nurse, and she ran out of the room. Wait, please. Give me 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes." Frank didn't move from his spot, standing between Arthur and his daughter's bed, a living shield of bone and muscle that didn't plan to yield. "Speak. You have until security arrives." Arthur swallowed. The words he had rehearsed on the way suddenly seemed stupid and inappropriate, but there was no turning back. "I know everything looks very bad. I know you have every right to hate me. But I ask you to think about the consequences. If this case goes to trial, everyone will suffer. Not just me, not just my father. Katie, too. Her name will be dragged through the press. Her photos will be on every website. Her history will be discussed by millions of strangers. Is that what you want for your daughter? Her story is already being discussed thanks to you and your video. That can be stopped. I'll find a way to remove the video from everywhere. I'll hire specialists to scrub the internet. I'll give Katie the divorce under any condition. I'll transfer all the properties I have left. She can start a new life from zero. But for that, you have to withdraw your statements and ask the journalists to stop the publications." Frank listened in silence. "I have money," Arthur continued, desperation creeping in. "Not as much as before, but enough. I can transfer $500,000 right now." "$1 million?" "I'll find the sum. $1 million. Yes, $1 million. Do you know how much I earn a year? A little over $50,000. $1 million is more than 20 years of my work, a lot of money for someone like me. See? It's very good money. You could. And you think for that money I'm going to betray my daughter?" Arthur fell to his knees, literally in the middle of the hospital room, onto the cold linoleum, under the gaze of the man he had despised and considered insignificant. "Please, I beg you. I'll do whatever you say. I'll do therapy. I'll never raise a hand against her again. I'll inform you of every step I take. Just don't send me to jail, please." Tears ran down his face, and they were real tears, not faked. For the first time in his life, he cried from fear of the future, which presented itself as a black hole. Prison, shame, the loss of everything he had, and no hope of returning to his previous life. Frank looked down at him, and in his eyes was something strange. Not the triumph of the victor, not malice, something resembling exhaustion and sadness. "Do you know what is most terrible about this whole story? That not even now do you understand what you did. You cry not because you caused my daughter pain. You cry because you are afraid of the consequences for yourself. Not once have you apologized to her. Not once have you asked how she feels. You only think of yourself, even now, on your knees." "That's not true. I love Katie. In my own way." "Exactly. In your own way. Your way means beating her when you're irritated, humiliating her when you want to feel powerful, locking her in the house so she doesn't dare complain. That isn't love, Arthur. That is a disease. And I sincerely hope that in prison they force you to treat it." The room door burst open, and the guards entered, followed by 2 police officers. They lifted Arthur from the floor, put his hands behind his back, and cuffed him. "Arthur Sterling, you are detained on suspicion of violating a restraining order and attempting to pressure a victim. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in court." They took him toward the exit. At the door, he turned back. Katie looked at him from the bed, and in her eyes there was no fear or hatred, only emptiness. The emptiness of a person who no longer feels anything toward her torturer. Katie, forgive me. Please, forgive me." She turned toward the wall and closed her eyes, and that silence was more terrible than any words. They took Arthur away. Frank stood for a moment looking at the closed door. Then he returned to the chair next to his daughter's bed. "Yes, Katie. Will he really go to jail? Really?" "Not for long, probably. Rich people know how to get away with things, but his life will never be the same. His name became synonymous with all this. They're going to recognize him on the street and point fingers. They won't hire him for any decent job. They won't accept him in any respectable circle. That is worse than jail, believe me. And his father will answer for his own crimes. So many things came out there that it's enough for many years of prison. Illegal kickbacks, tax evasion, bribing officials. His whole empire was built on dirty money, and now the whole world knows it." Katie fell silent, processing what she had heard. Then she turned her head and looked at her father. "Dad, Are you really sick? What you said about cancer. He didn't lie. It made no sense. It's true. I was diagnosed 2 weeks ago. Stage 4, metastases. Doctors say 2 or 3 months. Tears ran down her cheeks, and she tried to sit up in bed, but couldn't. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why didn't you call? And would you have answered? 3 years without answering my calls. For 3 years I was a stranger to you. I didn't want to impose. Sorry. Forgive me, Dad. I was a fool. I thought Arthur was happiness, that wealth was happiness. And it turned out that happiness is when someone loves you simply like that, without conditions, like you loved me. He leaned in and hugged her carefully, trying not to touch the wires and tubes. I always loved you, Katie, even when you didn't want to know about me, even when you said those terrible words about Mom. I loved you, and I will love you until my last breath. They stayed like that for a long time, father and daughter, finally found after so many years of separation. Outside the window of the room, the sun shone, indifferent to human tragedies and triumphs. Somewhere in the city, Arthur was being taken to the detention center. Somewhere his father was being interrogated. Somewhere journalists were writing new articles about the scandal of the century. But here, in the small ICU room, there was silence and calm for the first time in a long, long time. Take me home, please. When the doctors allow it, take me back north, to North Dakota. I want to see the northern lights. He smiled, and it was the first genuine smile in many days. I'll take you, I promise. The month passed like a single long day, full of events. Katie was moved out of ICU a week after they took Arthur to the detention center. Then came a regular room, long hours of recovery, endless visits from doctors and procedures that exhausted her as if she were unloading freight cars. But by her side, her father was always there. He arrived every morning and left only at nightfall when the nurses practically kicked him off the floor. Frank rented a small room in a hostel near the hospital because he didn't have money for a decent hotel. Mike, that man from the past, wired him a sum that made Frank's eyes widen in amazement. But he only took a small part, just what was necessary for lodging and food. He asked that the rest be kept for Katie for the future, when she got on her feet and started a new life. News about the Sterling family continued to resonate across the country. Richard Sterling was officially arrested and charged with various crimes, including massive tax evasion and bribing public officials. His lawyers tried to get house arrest, citing the age and health of the accused, but the court rejected it. There was too much evidence. The scandal had been too loud. Public opinion was following the process with too much attention. Arthur was charged with systematic beatings and aggravated assault. That video he had recorded while laughing and mocking his wife became the main evidence for the prosecution. They showed it in court. They showed it on the news. They discussed it on every TV program. Arthur Sterling's face had become a symbol of domestic violence, a graphic illustration of what happens behind the closed doors of rich houses. Katie refused to give interviews or appear personally at court hearings. Her testimony was recorded on video in the hospital in the presence of a lawyer and a psychologist, and that was enough. She spoke in a low voice, sometimes stopping to hold back the tears that overcame her, but she told everything. The first blow that happened 3 months after the wedding, the apologies and promises that were never kept, the fear that became her constant companion, the feeling of hopelessness when you understand that no one is going to help because your torturer has too much money and contacts. Frank sat beside her while they recorded her statement and held her hand. He didn't cry, though inside everything churned with pain for his daughter. He was simply there, as he should have been all those years. When they finally discharged Katie from the hospital, they left that same day. Frank bought 2 plane tickets to Williston, North Dakota, and Katie didn't say a word against it. She simply nodded when he asked if she was ready, gathered her few belongings in a small suitcase, and left the room without looking back. New York City, which once seemed like the city of her dreams, now only provoked the desire to flee as far as possible and never return. In the airport, she was recognized. A woman approached Katie and told her she admired her courage, that she was brave for escaping that nightmare. Katie thanked her and walked quickly toward the boarding gate, hiding her face behind dark glasses. Frank walked beside her, ready at any moment to protect her from stares and questions. The plane took off into the gray sky of the capital, and Katie finally allowed herself to relax. She looked out the window at the city receding below and thought about how strange life is. Just a month ago, she lay in the ICU not knowing if she would survive. Just a month ago, her father was a stranger to her whom she despised and blamed for all her misfortunes. And now she was flying with him to the north, to a place she once called his cave. And that place seemed like the only safe corner in the whole world. Yes, Katie. Tell me about home. What's it like now? Frank smiled and began to tell her about the endless prairie that turns green to the horizon in the spring, about the Missouri River winding through the land like a silver ribbon, about the small town where everyone knows everyone and no one locks their doors, about the silence so deep and full that at first it seems deafening and then becomes the most beautiful sound in the world. Katie listened, and for the first time in many years, she felt something resembling calm. Happiness was still far away, but calm, the feeling that the worst was behind her and ahead waited something new, perhaps unknown, but no longer terrifying that she felt. They landed in Williston late in the evening, when the sun had already set and the sky was dyed a deep orange. From the airport to the town where Frank lived, it was another 2-hour drive, and he had arranged for an old friend to pick them up. The friend's name was Bill. He had worked with Frank on the rigs and lived in the house next door. A burly, bearded man with kind eyes. He hugged Frank like a brother and shook Katie's hand carefully, as if afraid to break her. Heard about you, kiddo. The whole town followed the news. We were all worried. Katie felt embarrassed and didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to this simple, artless participation. In the high society circles she had moved in for the last few years, people expressed compassion with polite phrases behind which there was nothing but curiosity and a desire to gossip. And this stranger looked at her as if she were his own daughter, and his words were absolutely sincere. The road to the house took a while. Katie fell asleep in the back seat, covered with a warm blanket Bill had prudently brought along. Frank sat up front and watched the familiar road, the endless plains, the distant lights of farms. He was home, and for the first time in many years, he was home and not alone. His house turned out to be a sturdy wooden cabin with a sloped roof and a porch facing the river. Inside it was clean but modest: kitchen, living room, and 2 bedrooms. Bill had turned on the heater beforehand, and the house was warm and cozy. Katie looked around, getting used to the new place, and suddenly noticed a photograph on the wall. Herself, small, about 5 years old, in the arms of her smiling father. Next to them, Mom, young and beautiful, laughing at the camera. You kept it? I kept all the photos. They were always with me, even when you didn't want to know me. Katie approached the wall and looked at the photo for a long time. She almost didn't remember Mom like that, alive and cheerful. In her memory, only a pale woman in a hospital bed remained, weakening every day. And Dad, who was always working and whom she blamed for not being able to save Mom. Forgive me, Dad. For everything. For those words about Mom. I was a child. I didn't understand. You were a suffering child. Children say terrible things when they suffer. It's normal. I forgave you a long time ago. They hugged in the middle of the small living room, and Katie cried while Frank stroked her head and whispered something soothing, just as he did when she was very small and woke up from nightmares. The first days in North Dakota were difficult. Katie got used to the silence, to the absence of the city hustle, to the slow pace of life that here seemed the only possible one. She slept a lot, ate a lot, walked a lot in the surroundings, breathing the clean, cold air. Little by little, the bruises on her body faded. The pain in her ribs diminished, and the nightmares that tormented her every night began to come less frequently. Our Frank was close, but he didn't pressure her. He didn't try to force events. He cooked, told stories about the locals and their eccentricities, showed her his favorite spots in the woods near the river. One night he woke her at midnight and led her to the porch, wrapping a thick shawl around her shoulders. Look. Katie raised her eyes to the sky and stood motionless. Shimmering curtains of green and violet light danced across the horizon, the aurora borealis. She had seen them in photos and movies, but the reality was 1,000 times more beautiful. It was so beautiful it took her breath away. I wanted to show you this before, years ago, but you didn't want to come. I was a fool. I thought happiness was in big cities and expensive things, and it turns out it's here, in the silence, in the beauty, in having someone by your side who truly loves you. They stood on the porch watching the northern lights, father and daughter, finally found. And that moment was worth all the lost years, all the tears and resentments, all the nightmare lived. 2 weeks after arriving, Katie found a pregnancy test in the bathroom that she had bought in the city and forgotten in her bag. She spent a long time looking at the box without daring to open it. She had suspected it for several days, but she was afraid to know the truth, afraid of what that truth would mean. The test showed 2 lines. She sat on the edge of the bathtub and looked at that small plastic object that changed everything. A baby, his baby. The baby of the man who beat her for 8 months and almost killed her. And what to do now with that knowledge? Frank found her an hour later. She was still sitting in the bathroom with the test in her hands and a vacant gaze fixed on the wall. "Katie, what happened?" She handed him the test in silence. He looked at the 2 lines, and on his face appeared an expression she couldn't decipher. It's his. A long pause. Frank sat next to her on the edge of the tub and took her hand. "And what do you want to do?" "I don't know." "I don't know, Dad. I can't think of this baby without remembering him, what he did to me. But at the same time, it's my baby too. My blood, part of me. You don't have to make a decision right now. You have time to think. And what would you do in my place?" Frank fell silent, gathering his thoughts. "I can't answer that question. It is your body and your life. Whatever decision you make will be the right one because it will be your decision. I will be by your side, whatever happens." "How long?" "What? How long will you be by my side?" The doctors said 2 or 3 months. Almost a month has passed. Frank smiled with that special smile that had appeared on him in the last week, the smile of a man who has accepted his fate and no longer fears it. Doctors say many things, but they don't know everything. They don't know that now I have a reason to live, that I wake up every morning and see you, and that gives me strength for 1 more day. Maybe I'll live 2 months, maybe 6, maybe a year, no one knows for sure. But the time I have left, I will spend with you. Katie hugged him and cried, but they were no longer tears of despair, but tears of relief. Tears of a person who finally understood she wasn't alone. Another week passed. Katie thought a lot, walked a lot through the woods, spoke a lot with her father about the past and future. And one morning she woke up with the feeling that the decision had arrived by itself, from somewhere inside her, from the depths of her soul. She went out to the porch where Frank was drinking coffee and watching the river. "Dad, I've decided." "And what did you decide?" "I'm going to have the baby. It's not his fault he has that father. It's my son, and I'm going to love him, and I will do everything so that he is never like Arthur. I will raise him differently." Frank put down the cup and looked at his daughter. Tears shone in his eyes, but he was smiling. "You are strong, Katie. Stronger than I thought. Stronger than you yourself thought. It's because you are by my side. Because I'm not alone anymore." He got up and hugged her. They stood on the porch hugging, watching the northern sky begin to lighten in the east. A new day, a new life, a new hope. Frank Miller lived another 14 months, much longer than the doctors had predicted. He watched his daughter's belly round with each month. He held her hand when she gave birth in the small regional hospital. He was the first to hold his grandson, a tiny baby with dark eyes and a stubborn chin. They named him Frank, in honor of his grandfather. Frank managed to teach him his first words, managed to rock him on his knees, managed to tell him the stories he once told Katie. And then, a quiet winter night, when a soft snow was falling outside and the northern lights illuminated the horizon, he closed his eyes and didn't open them again. Katie found him in the morning, lying peacefully in bed with a smile on his lips. She didn't scream or cry. She simply sat beside him, took his hand, and stayed like that for a long time, saying goodbye to the man who had given her a second life, who had shown that love is stronger than money, stronger than fear, stronger even than death. They buried him in the small cemetery behind the town, from where you could see the endless river valley. On the tombstone, they wrote simply, "Frank Miller. Father. Grandfather. A man who did the right thing." And Katie stayed to live in that small house, with the porch facing the river. She raised her son, worked remotely as a designer as she once dreamed in her youth. Sometimes at night, she went out to the porch and watched the stars over the water. And it seemed to her that her father, somewhere up there, was also watching those lights. Arthur Sterling received 4 years in prison. His father, 8 years in a federal maximum security penitentiary, their empire collapsed. Their name became synonymous with the worst kind of corruption and abuse. His story entered the books as an example that money gives neither the right to violence nor impunity. And little Frank grew up as a healthy and happy boy who knew that his grandfather had been a hero, that he had flown to rescue Mom when she was in trouble, that he had made a single call that changed everything. And when Frank grew up, he too would do the right thing. Because that was how he had been raised. Because love is transmitted from generation to generation. Because a single person can change the world if they have the courage to try. Friends, this is where the story I wanted to tell you ends. A story about how true strength is not in money or contacts, but in love and the willingness to protect those who matter to us. A story about how justice is possible even when it seems all doors are closed. A story about how it is never too late to return to those we love and never too late to start over. If this story touched something in your heart, if you worried for the characters and rejoiced in their victories, please like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me create new stories and share them with you. Write in the comments what you think of Frank's actions. Did he do right by calling his friend? What would you have done in his place? I really care to know your opinion. And remember, if you or someone close to you faces domestic violence, do not stay silent. Seek help. A single call really can change everything. Thanks for staying with me until the end. See you in the next stories. And before you go, I want to leave you with a final reflection. This story reminds us that family bonds, even if years of silence and distance pass, never disappear entirely. That sometimes karma delays, but it always arrives. And that a father's love has no expiration date. If you have ever distanced yourself from someone who loves you, perhaps today is the moment to take that first step. Tell me in the comments if this story made you think of your own family or if you have lived something similar. Don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss any stories. We'll read each other soon.